Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. Good evening if you are joining us from across the ocean, or good morning if you are joining us from the West Coast. I am Magda Tedder. I am the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies and a co-director of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. And I am delighted to welcome you to our event in our Black Studies and Jewish Studies in Conversation, which my colleague Wes Alsanat and I began in 2021. Both the Atlantic slave trade and the Holocaust have left indelible imprints on societies, public landscapes, and the collective and public memory that affected regions across Europe, the United States, South America, Central America, and other places, and Africa, of course, as well. In Europe, towns and cities, some of which were predominantly Jewish, were emptied of the population that had lived there for centuries, after their Jewish residents had been murdered. Yet because they lived there for centuries, their presence is indelibly etched on the town's material remains and memory, however suppressed it may have been. Similarly, slavery left a lasting mark on societies that were involved in the slave trade on both sides of the Atlantic, including in material remains and landscape. Ana Lucia Araujo, a leading scholar on material culture and memory of transatlantic slavery, and Yechiel Weizman, a scholar of history and memory of the Holocaust, are joining us today to discuss the memory, heritage, material remains, and the spatial legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and the Holocaust. Both scholars deal with the process, still ongoing, of coming to terms with the painful and dark past. Both grapple with the echoes of that past in the present. Professor Araujo with slavery and Professor Weizman with the Holocaust and the Jewish past. In both cases, that past is processed through different modalities of memory: cultural memory, collective memory, public memory, official memory, and their dialogue with public history and art, as Professor Araujo has noted in her book, Slavery and the Age of Memory. So now let me introduce the distinguished speakers who are joining us today. Professor Ana Lucia Araujo is a social and cultural historian and an art historian and a professor of history at the historically Black Howard University in Washington, D.C. Professor Araujo's work explores the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and the present-day legacies, as well as the memory, heritage, and visual and culture of slavery. She writes, speaks, and publishes in English, Portuguese, French, and Spanish, and her work has been translated into German and Dutch, and in fact, she's joining us today from Amsterdam. She is the author of many books, and some of them can see behind me, including Shadows of the Slave Past, Memory, Heritage, and Slavery, Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past, and the just hot off the press, The Gift, How Objects of Prestige Shaped the Atlantic Slave Trade and Colonialism. In 2023, she was a Getty Residential Senior Scholar at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. Yechiel Weizman is the scholar of history and memory of the Holocaust and material history and its aftermath. He teaches at the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Bar-Ilan University. Prior to joining Bar-Ilan, Professor Weizman was a research fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Jewish History and Culture and a co-investigator in the research group mapping the archipelago of lost towns, post-Holocaust urban lacuna in the Polish, Belarusian, Ukrainian borderlands at the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage at Humboldt University in Berlin. He is the author of Unsettled Heritage, Living Next to Poland's Material Jewish Traces After the Holocaust, which was published last year by Cornell University Press, and which is also right behind me. Co-moderating with me will be my colleague, Wes Alsenet. For the past 3 years, we have been team teaching a class on anti-Semitism and racism. And Wes is a historian of 19th century US and Caribbean. His scholarship covers the shared histories of African Americans, the African diaspora, and the Atlantic world. This program is made possible thanks to the generosity of so many friends of the center, the members of the advisory board, the Schridler Gift Fund for the Fordham University, Fordham trustees, and several Henry Miller and several anonymous donors and individuals without whose support we could not offer you these stimulating programs. So now let's get started. I'll just mention that you can send your comments and questions in the Q&A section of the screen. And if we'll try to get to them if time permits at the end of our conversation. So Wes, let's get us going.
Yes, so Magda, thank you for getting us started, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I would like to start by asking both of our guests if they could please tell us a little bit about their work. And we'll start with you, Professor Araujo, and then we'll move to Weizman. You're on mute.
Here we go. Thank you so much, Magda and Wes. Yechiel as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Well, the story of my work, nearly 20 years ago, I became interested in understanding then how the history of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery was concealed in the public space, and part of this interest is due to the fact that I was born and raised in Brazil, the country that imported the largest number of enslaved Africans during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. We're talking here about nearly 6 million enslaved people who were sent to Brazil. About 5 million then came to arrive alive in Brazil then during this very long period of the Atlantic slave trade. Despite then the central role that slavery had in Brazilian history, the country where I was raised, there were very few visible traces of the Atlantic slave trade in former slave ports, for example, such as Salvador in Bahia or Rio de Janeiro. And indeed, until the 1990s, then I would say that 1990 is about 150 years after the end of the slave trade to Brazil, and about 1 century after the abolition of slavery in Brazil. There was, of course, a collective memory of slavery, and then preserved by the descendants of enslaved people in Brazil, who passed down this memory from generation to generation. But despite also, and there was to a certain extent a cultural memory of this slavery past that was in play as well, that survived, for example, in rituals and in certain spaces, especially in the rural areas. But this memory remained concealed in especially in the urban areas, then in the public space of urban areas. And over time, I could see then, on the one hand, that we could have this state of concealing the Atlantic slave trade past, that this was not only limited to Brazil, and this coincides then with the moment that I left the country. And it happened in London, it happened in Liverpool, in Bristol, in Nantes, in France, then in Bordeaux, and even here in Amsterdam. And on the other hand, this situation, as I have argued then in my work, the books that Magda mentioned, this situation started really to change in the 1990s, by the end of the Cold War. And this was the moment when more or less organized groups then started and claiming, demanding that this slave trading past and the past associated with slavery to be recognized in the public space. And of course, that these social actors, they demanded then the construction of memorials, the museum exhibitions, monuments, recognizing these atrocities. And at this point, there was also a growing concern then to bring to light the built and material heritage of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. This heritage that could be seen, for example, in slave markets, in plantation buildings, and even in cemeteries where enslaved people were buried. And very often this happened then in the cemeteries meant then waste dumps or places where there were unmarked graves that in many ways contrasted with the places where those who were slave owners or slave traders were buried. Now, then we have this rise of the public memory in the 1990s. This, I have argued, and this will be interesting to discuss today, because this happened also by the same time when the memory of the Holocaust starts re-emerging then with the end of the Cold War. And during this period, you are going to see also the rise of these heritage sites that in many ways have been buried. Then these were slave cemeteries, but there were also then we had slave cemeteries, for example, the African Burial Ground in New York City, in Lagos, in Portugal in 2009, the oldest European slave cemetery associated with the Atlantic slave trade also emerged at that point. And then the Valongo Wharf in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, that reappears when the government started and preparing the Olympic Games then in the city. Then we have this connection then among different places in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Then that this story started re-emerging and becoming visible. And in many ways, this happens because descendants of enslaved people who claim the identity of being descendants of enslaved people, or people who are simply racialized as Black in Europe, but who migrated then since the period of European colonial rule in the main cities then in the European continent, but also we see the same kind of movement in the case of the Americas. Now, then my work then is about material culture and how the past of the Atlantic slave trade is reenacted, and how it remains present today in the societies that participated in these atrocities. And also at the same time, when I write this work as a more traditional historian than looking at archival records, my work is still informed by this approach that consider memory as a central element, meaning that what is happening today matters to how we look at these past atrocities. Then I will stop here.
Thank you for that explanation. So let's go to Professor Weizman.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for having this event. I'm very happy to be here. And I will say a few words about my book, which I think originated with my own personal encounter with the traces of Jewish culture in Poland as I was traveling there in recent years. And I was particularly interested in small towns where prior to the Second World War, Jews constitute around half or even more of the local population. And following the Holocaust, in almost all of these towns, not a single person remained. But what did remain was the material traces, namely cemeteries, usually abandoned, half destroyed, burial grounds, mass graves of Holocaust victims, synagogues, and other ritual sites. And for me, the question two questions was particularly interesting. First, what happened to those sites? How did they function for the local Polish population who continued to live there while half of their community was gone? How were these places perceived, treated, both by the local authorities and the local population? I was interested more on the local policies, the attitudes of low-key official rather than state policy, because for me this question was really a question of how can one live next to traces of absent neighbors who, especially in those towns, were murdered or deported broad daylight. People saw, heard what happened to their neighbors. In some cases, as we know from recent historical discoveries, some of them took part in the killing, denunciation. The Jewish property usually moved into non-Jewish hands. So what was the meaning ascribed to the material remains since the end of the war, basically until today? And what I was able to find out through ethnographical research and through archival research in local archive was that the question, the allegedly neutral question, what to do with the Jewish cemetery or what to do with the synagogue, was never neutral. It was so ambivalent, and it harbored questions regarding to memory, identity, secrets, open secrets, and it was a question that always threatened to evoke certain memories and episodes from the past. And it was a question that was dealt with in a very intimate way. So it was far from just a formal municipal issue. So when discussing the question, should we destroy, preserve this Jewish cemetery in this little town, local officials were basically dealing with the most intimate, painful topics that pertain to the crux of the local identity, and so does local population. So I was trying to also to examine what were the local practices that were developed surrounding these places, how people used to talk and still talk about these Jewish traces. And in many ways, these traces, whether abandoned, completely erased, or preserved in some cases, in a way, I would say, stood in for the Jews and acquired many different layers of meanings that, as I argue, testify to the very unhomely, I would say, complicated and ambivalent way of dealing with the Holocaust. So these places, cemeteries and synagogues, while themselves are not memorials or monuments, became what I call unintentional monuments. So they became some sort of very weird, antagonistic places of memory, in a way that I think undermines the boundaries between remembrance and forgetfulness. And this very interesting and dialectical process between remembering and forgetting, I think it still continues today. And in this sense, I think I found some similarities with Anna's work, especially in the way that remembering and forgetting are two sides sometimes of the same process. So I think I will end here this short presentation.
Thank you both, and that actually sort of leads nicely into the question that I wanted to ask you about in what way do material culture and these material remains that you both are examining forced a reckoning with that past. That is, don't allow us to forget at some level, right? They force a reckoning of that past. How are these material remains different from other historical remains that we might have that we encounter as historians? And Yechiel, you in particular, you call those remains disturbing remains. And again, it's something that's, again, poking that memory and that what you were talking about, that complicating that forgetting and the thing. So I wonder whether both of you from your work can speak a little bit about that. In what way do they force a reckoning with that troubled past? Anna, do you want to go, since Yechiel just...
Okay. This is an excellent question. I think that is at the heart of what I am doing now, which is that then when you are talking about tangible evidence, that is then material remains or material culture, then first of all, many of these remains or material culture items, then material remains, for example, then human remains, or tombstones, or then cemeteries. These are in the public space. They are not items that are in the written archive and that demand that one individual have, usually one or a group of individuals have the control of the archives, or one historian needs to go and open the folders to find the records. And very often, if this happens, perhaps you are going to have a book or an academic article that you take very long to be out. Whereas these remains, they are totally, they are exposed to the community. The community itself, they have direct access to these remains. On the other hand, they are tangible than evidence, because the human remains, these were people. Then these were the real people who lived and survived, or then eventually were killed during this past atrocities. Then and other material remains that could be objects that are not human remains. They were still things that people created, then that people hold those items, that people gave meaning to those things. It can be a bag, it can be a shoe, it can be a tombstone. All these are things that people created, then those who were victims of these atrocities. Many of these items didn't survive if they were made in materials that would perish. But in many cases, they did. Many of these items are in museums. Others are then the tombstones, for example, is a good example. And of course, human remains. And I think that is the lived experience. They are tangible witnesses of this past that are accessible to those who are here today and that were touched and were part of those who are no longer with us.
Michel?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, those places are tangible in the sense that they are out there. So in my case, when I examine cemeteries and synagogues, so even if they are repressed outside of the boundaries or being covered or hidden, they have such a strong symbolic charge that in a way endows them with a really unique kind of presence. For hundreds of years, these are the places that were central in the non-Jewish local folklore about the Jews. So already before the Holocaust, these places were the most strange and foreign objects in the townscape, but also very familiar. And after the Holocaust, I think the fact that these places remain empty, many of them abandoned, this new state of affairs only enhance their very strong presence because they emphasize this striking gap between the very rooted historical presence of the Jews and the total absence. And this gap, I think, gave these historical remains a status of both, I would say, relics, like really parts of people. And this is, you can see how local people treated those places, but also, I think, metonyms. So cemeteries, synagogues, other communal and ritual sites were really talked and negotiated as if these are the metonyms of the Jews and also of the Jewish faith. So the Holocaust, the tragic history that surrounded these places, was also a factor that couldn't allow these places to really be erased from local maps, especially in the case of Jewish cemeteries, where most of them actually functioned during the war as killing sites. So there were victims of the Holocaust buried there. And although, according to the official local narrative, these places were erased from the local maps, for example, they were there, and their presence was kept in local discourse, in certain practices, terms. And I think you can see it in many countries in post-war Europe, but maybe especially in Europe, this gap between the presence and absence turned these places into really liminal spaces, which only made their function and symbolic status even more peculiar and radiating.
Actually, this so your point about the visibility or silence thereof leads to a question that Magda and I wanted to ask. If you could expand a little bit about this notion of a conspiracies of silence around the burdens of the past, especially in public memory and public history, given that you have these very sort of in the public space material remains, and yet circling around it is a conspicuous silence. So we wanted to ask you, and this is both true for slavery and the Holocaust as difficult subjects, and not just difficult subjects, but subjects that actually implicate, in whichever societies they took place, implicate the dominant groups, right? The dominant population. So how do these conspiracies of silence about the past distort public memory of the event? So that's one question, and it's a multi-pronged question that we have. So how does it distort public memory of the event? But also, what role do you believe material remains play in these conspiracies? Meaning, at which point can they also disrupt the silence? I guess, Yechiel, we could start with you, since you had, in some ways, already alluding to this.
Okay, thank you. So, so in the case of Poland and the Holocaust, there are many local conspiracies of silence. Some of them are being disclosed only recently, of places in which the local population, the local Polish population, took part in the murder of Jews. For example, in Jedwabne in the summer of '41, and other places. And for during the communist time until recently, these episodes were kept under this conspiracy of silence, term coined by Bavel. And it was a secret, but an open secret. Everybody knew exactly what had happened, but it wasn't discussed outside of a very specific group of people. An attempt to break the silence during the communist year, where there was no free speech concerning the war, were usually doomed to failure. What was interesting is, and I examined several towns that had this past of local collaboration, that you can see in the local treatment of Jewish site and Jewish traces, practices that in a way try to reinforce some sort of forgetfulness, an attempt to obliterate the Jewish site as some sort of, I would call it even some sort of ritualistic mode of negative memory. But what was interesting, you see, was that the fact that these sites somehow existed in a way kept the memory of what had happened alive. So in the sense that, for example, in the 80s, when there is growing interest in Poland surrounding the Holocaust, local inhabitants who are starting to ask questions, to hear rumors from their family members, understand that something had happened, that there was once a Jewish community. And the first arena where they try to wrestle with the Jewish past is those material remains. And inevitably, those attempts to preserve the Jewish cemetery, to ask very innocent questions, immediately scratch the surface and immediately touch upon this very sensitive and hidden subject. And you can see in many cases how, and it's usually individuals, really individuals that have the courage to, in a way, crack these conspiracies. They start asking questions, trying to renovate a cemetery, looking for tombstones, and then they evoke this hidden subject, of course, arousing antagonism, hostility, but then again, in many cases, they were the one who were able to really encourage some sort of beginning of open discussion. Now, it's hard to say that these attempts are successful because, unfortunately, it's very hard to find example where there is some sort of positive reckoning or overcoming or dealing with this local episode in a way that will encourage open dialogue. But at least these secrets are no longer under these networks of silence, I would say.
Professor Araujo, one parallel that I saw to Professor Weizman's work in that sense, in the same context, is in your book, Shadows of the Slave Past, you discuss how there was a tension within local populations, between perpetrators and victims, as to, for instance, even sometimes when certain monuments were meant to commemorate the memory of the enslaved, oftentimes it, either by accident or by fiat, just also happened to glorify those who had been integral to the slave trade itself. So I wonder, and how people discuss those tensions was sometimes often something that even runs deep into families, if you could speak on
that. Thank you so much. I think that it's interesting because, of course, when you are looking at the particular context of Poland, and then this is a particular context, but if you look at the problem of the similar process regarding slavery and the Atlantic slave trade is a little bit different, because it's very hard to talk about the disappearance of then slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. There is an entire discussion about then the goal was not to exterminate then populations of African descent, but put them to work. In many cases, it was, in many cases, was working up to death. But in many, there is a big difference if we consider, for example, then an European city, an European former slave trading port, such as Liverpool or Nantes, and the Black populations in this context that is usually very small then in comparison to a country like Brazil, or in a city like Rio de Janeiro or Salvador in Bahia, where there is a majority of the population who is of African descent. Then it's very hard to, we cannot dissociate these conspiracies of silence from the problem of race and racism. The silence is around the fact that racism is still a very important force, that racism derives of this racialization that took place during the era of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, and that these populations, despite being visible, despite in some situations occupying, being even the majority of the population, there is still silence about the work they provided, the work that their ancestors provided, that the atrocities that were committed, the places where these atrocities occurred. And this, I think, that is the interesting point to where we can make these comparisons. And of course, the problem of the perpetrators. The perpetrators, they continue to be visible in the names of the streets, the monuments that were erected honoring them. Until 2020, we saw, of course, that the wave of taking down monuments started earlier, but in 2020 is really here in Europe at the moment when during that the pandemic and after the assassination of George Floyd, that we are going to see really finally these movements to take down monuments honoring slave traders being successful, because the demands have been there for very long. And of course, even in places that were built like to be a house museum, then, and though the house museum, for example, we have in Providence, then the John Brown House in Providence, Rhode Island, here in the United States, and just near Brown University, we have this kind of house museum that carries the name of people who were slave traders. And despite the story being everywhere in these buildings and even in the objects that are there, very often we don't see any reference to the fact that these individuals were slave traders. And I would say that even today, when we see these discussions about reparations, for example, which I don't want to enter there, but some people who appear then, oh, they're now family of former slave trader or former slave owner who will now provide a couple of thousands of dollars to programs then promoting social justice. But at the end of the day, these descendants of perpetrators are also in many situations also trying to promote themselves as benevolent individuals, because you need to have in mind that in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, many of these slave traders, they reconverted themselves at the time as benevolent or people who were doing philanthropic work. They were funding schools, and other initiatives of this kind that led at some point to portray them as people who were benevolent, but erasing them and silencing the fact that their wealth was made from the trade in human beings. Then it's an interesting discussion.
The point you're making, the sort of remaking one's past and identity in this sort of benevolent, well, in a strange way, I think speaks to the point that Yechiel, you make in your book about the distinction between overcoming the past and the reckoning with the past. So I wonder whether, and again, I think this is the nice sort of would be contrast with how it's done, whether you two could reflect on that distinction, which I think to many people would not sound like, of course, we want to overcome the past, but the distinction between overcoming and reckoning.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And in this sense, I see a lot of similarities between the commemoration of the Holocaust in Poland and in general, and the commemoration of the Atlantic slave trade, because especially in recent years, there is this phenomenon of really trying to commemorate, to remember, to preserve traces of Jewish culture, to commemorate the Holocaust in the state or local level. And it seems that everybody in Poland are dealing with commemorating the Holocaust. But in many ways, when you take a close look on this initiative, you can see that there, in many cases, the motive is, as you say, to overcome. And to overcome, in a way, is to deal with the past and to put it aside. And in a way, to say, okay, it's done. We can move on. We paid our debt. And I think this is maybe a universal tension in the act of commemoration or tragedy, that commemoration in a way acknowledges the past and wishes to remedy some sort of injustice and to move on. But how do you commemorate something, commemorate a traumatic event that involves also matters of local collaboration, while keeping the wound open? And this is, I think, the heart of the tension in Poland. And many critics have observed that in many official initiatives of the government and other institutions, the wish to commemorate the Jews is some sort of a way to some sort of lip service in order to, that basically implements the demands, the norms that require people to mourn over the victims of the Holocaust. And you can see it sometimes even in very small local initiatives, when you have an abandoned cemetery and the city wishes to renovate it and to create some sort of nice memorial park and to make this place very neat and tidy. But then again, this place in a way loses its historical importance. It is basically some sort of nice local heritage site that loses, I think, its traumatic nature. And we can see in many cases very orchestrated and calculated attempts, for example, to renovate a deserted synagogue, to turn it into some sort of house of Polish-Jewish dialogue, to emphasize the peaceful coexistence between Poles and Jews, which in many ways it is important. In some cases it's true, but in many cases you can see how these initiatives are trying to offset the historical narrative, which is not as peaceful as some people might wish to imagine. And so this tension is basically this is the characteristic tensions in today's memory work in Poland, and I think around Europe. And usually it's very hard to find initiatives that are able both to encourage an attempt of coming to terms with a painful past, but not by means of overcoming, of domesticating this past, but leaving some sort of haunting element, which is also important, not only for Jews or Jewish descendants, but also for local communities, in order to deal with very pressing issues within Polish society, such as racism, such as, for example, we see what happens in the border of Poland in Belarus, where you have thousands of refugees stranded there. So in a way, local memory actors in Poland are really trying hard to negotiate Jewish memory in a way that will encourage dealing with pressing questions of the present time.
You know, actually, on this same topic, Professor Weizman, your book I mean, titled Unsettled Heritage, one of the more unsettled part actually was the way memory often was being inverted, right? The process of inverting the memory either through consecrating certain sites, profanate, you showed how there were processes of just completely profaning spaces. So I'm wondering if in the context of Black sites of memory, Professor Arroyo, if you've seen any sort of comparable or contrast to this idea of inverting memory at work.
I think that it's an excellent question, because it's probably visible in many different places. I mentioned earlier the case of this cemetery that was uncovered in 2009 in Lagos, in Portugal. Then there were Africans and enslaved Africans that were buried. It was indeed a sort of waste dump. Then there were no tombs, nothing. And this the site was transformed. The discovery of the site was done when they were creating a parking lot, and the place, there is a mini golf that was created on the site where these enslaved men, women, and children were buried. In many of the fights, I would say, even in the United States, that African Americans were uncovering the cemeteries. Almost, I would say, if you go to the news and you put cemetery, slave cemetery, and African American cemetery, and you do a Google News search, we're going to see that this is happening almost on a monthly basis. And many of the fights is really that to not have a shopping mall or not having a parking lot then constructed over the sites. But there are much worse examples where the sites were totally erased to promote an idea than and where we have, for example, wharfs in Bahia where there are now expensive condos or restaurants, then how you can have finally that you are invited to have a great meal that most Afro-Brazilians in a city like Salvador in Bahia cannot afford. And these sites exactly located on top of the sites where enslaved people were disembarked. Then there are many of these situations where there are the several layers. There are situations in which you have this contrast, because on the one hand you have a site that memorializes, or at least is a heritage site associated with the victims of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. And just next, there is a monument that was constructed honoring people who profited or who victimized enslaved Africans. And even in the United States, we have examples like this. Now there is this new international museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Then Charleston was the largest, then the port in the United States that where the largest number of enslaved Africans disembarked. There was no monument and no memorial to enslaved Africans there, but there is a big memorial to the Irish immigrants in Charleston, South Carolina. Then this is the kind of contrast that is interesting to see, because of course all this is happening in the public space, and there is this competition in the public space to occupy this public space. And depending on the period, then African populations of African descent did not have necessarily the political power to assert themselves and to win this battle of public memory and create their monuments. Then what we have, depending on the case, is these different layers and these different monuments in dialogue. And of course, these are things that continue happening, will continue. Then monuments are being taken down, others are being built, and this is a process that is never ending, which is this is why I would say that it's important that we keep paying attention to that and seeing how memory and heritage are indeed dynamic.
So if I may follow up on the process, that whether you could tell us a little bit about this process, because I mean, you've in a fascinating way, you connected to the recovery and political power around what's in public space. What was the work? What was the process that allowed for this, for slavery and the memory of slavery to finally come out of that space of concealment? Or even though as you were telling us, even today it continues to be a place of concealment and creation, these fancy dining spaces or other sites. But what takes it, and what was the process for it to eventually become highlighted in public space? And especially since you are mentioning it, it happens especially in the 1990s. So I wonder whether you could sort of walk us through a little bit that process of moving from concealment to the public awareness of these sites.
Thank you. This is an excellent question, and I think that Yechiel will be able also to give some insights on these connections, especially in terms of the period, because Poland is an interesting case for the early 1990s because of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the communist regimes. I would say that is a moment. There are several things in play. I would say there are several moments that are important. Of course, the end of the Second World War is an important moment in this story, and there are already elements that emerge, and then simultaneously regarding then the Holocaust survivors and then the memorialization of the Atlantic slave trade and the slavery. But in the 1990s, with the fall of the communist regimes and the end of the Cold War, there is much more space for connections of Black populations that were apart than during the previous period. Then this globalization that occurs at that point, that the increasing globalization and connections that occur at that moment make easier, I would say, to groups that have been oppressed during then decades. In some places we had the dictatorships going on, the case of Brazil, for example. When this ends, this is the moment when, one, we can talk about racism, then we can talk about the persistence of racism as a legacy of the period of the slavery. And when these populations of African descent can make connections, can identify, then go to the public sphere, but also identify elements of their struggle that exist elsewhere during that period, then this is an important point. Then the end of the Cold War and these connections that are now possible. The other point is commemoration. Then usually then these waves that start these processes are usually associated with commemoration dates. Then 1992, it was the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. And this was a moment when there was this reckoning with the past, that the context that created the Atlantic slave trade with the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. Then institutions, of course, played an important role at that point. I remember that UNESCO had an important role in all this. But social actors who are now organized and can take these issues in their own hands. Then we have a number of elements that are international on the one hand, on the other hand, national, but this commemorative dates, they matter. Then 1992 is one. In France, 1998, that was the anniversary of their abolition, 150th anniversary of their abolition. Also, we have, for example, 2007, when it is the anniversary of the 200th anniversary of the British slave trade, the end of the British slave trade. We had a number of the films that came up at that point. And this is a moment also when we see this acceleration. And I would say that this process was there, but what we can identify after the end of the Second World War, 1999, is 2007, is a sort of acceleration of this process, but always by people who have always been doing this work. In the case of the African American population, of the Afro-Brazilian population, of the Afro-Colombian population, who have been doing this work all the time, but it's at these moments, these crucial moments, that they are allowed finally to have a voice.
Yechiel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think this this moment at the beginning of the 90s, the end of communism is crucial in this regard, both in terms of turning the Holocaust into foundational past, as Alon Confino talk about it, and I think in a way it also it can also account to the processes that Anna described, because what happens after the end of the Cold War, the war, the communism, capitalism, it's no longer the founding narrative of the world. There's a new story, new stories that begin to emerge, while this ideological rivalry is no longer in play. And this opens up a proliferation of memories, of stories, of personal experiences to be heard in the open. And I think, yes, that the end of communism, this is exactly when the Holocaust becomes some sort of, this is where it gains its moral imperative. And this is the beginning of the 90s. This is when Steven Spielberg initiated his project of collecting video testimonies. And I think this is the moment that Annette Viviorka defined as the age of the witness. Yes, the age of the witness, in which the key player in in historical conflict is the witness. And this is when we can start retelling the story of the Holocaust from the perspective of the witnesses, of the victims. They gain some sort of holy status. And I think in this sense, the commemorative language developed around this year surrounding the memory of the Holocaust, you can see the inauguration of the Holocaust Museum in Washington and other initiatives. I think in a way it also influences the way that other actors are trying to commemorate and to remember historical events as lived experiences, as not only historical events, but stories that happen to people, to individuals. And I think these new sensibilities which emerge then are basically starting within the global memory culture of the Holocaust. But we can see, and also it's showing it in her books, how it influences and really dictates a new vocabulary of memory, I think.
Actually, this is we actually had a question about this very point that Professor Weizman made as a question for you, Professor Araujo, which is, can you discuss a little bit how the global memorization of the Holocaust sort of influence approaches to the memorials and remembrance and heritage about the Atlantic slave trade or slavery?
Yes, I think that this, either when we are referring to the issue of how slavery is memorialized or the demands of reparations for slavery that reemerged after the end of the Second World War, there are, these two atrocities are in dialogue, the way they are memorialized. And of course, you have Mark Rothberg with his work on multidirectional memory that I think that is crucial to think about this dialogue. But certainly has been, then there were mutual influences, then especially then in urban areas, of course. And one point that Yechiel mentioned, that is the issue of witness, which I believe that is I would start through that point, because one of the differences that up to this day we had between how slavery is memorialized and how the Holocaust is memorialized is that for the Holocaust, the victims are alive. Some were alive. Many of them were still alive, perhaps in the 1990s. Whereas most of them, the Holocaust survivors, then I was not talking about the victims, I was referring to the survivors. Many of the survivors were still alive in the 1990s. And this is no longer the case. Then, of course, that these testimonies, they were collected, recorded, filmed, but by the 1990s, there were no formerly enslaved people who were alive. The only ones who were alive at that point and now were the descendants. Then this direct memory, the witnesses were no longer there. Then already, I would say, by the 1960s, because in places like Brazil, there were still freed people alive in the early 1930s, which is completely crazy, but it was the case because slavery lasted until...
Sorry to interrupt, and I think I might add, and this is a very little factor that I myself stumbled on. I think the Washington Post reported, it was about 5 years ago, that the last person who had a direct sort of, I think was probably born into slavery, had passed some 6 years ago. It was the last person.
Could be. In the case of Brazil, I think there is a woman, and a formerly enslaved woman, who signed a petition for reparations in the early 1990s. Then she was alive in the early 1990s. Then the difference, of course, in the case of Brazil is that there was, unlike the United States, where we had the WPA narratives and the slave narratives, then we don't have those. Nobody did by the time this work of collecting the testimonies. But it's still, when we are referring to memorializing the slavery, there are social actors who can play this role of witnesses in some historical sites, even in sites that are sites of memory and not necessarily heritage sites, because there is recognition that that the voice of the witnesses, that this is an important point to make this memory alive. Now, what is going to be interesting, and is interesting about this initiative that you are leading, is that more and more, I believe that the ways the Holocaust will be memorialized will be more in connection with the ways that the Atlantic slave trade is memorialized, because the survivors are leaving us. Then this is one of the points, but some of the issues has been, for example, to make the victims visible. One of the issues that I discuss in this book, Slavery in the Age of Memory, is the issue of naming, because one of the important points that we have among the Jewish community as well, that people in situations of exile and persecution, they had themselves either they were forced to convert to Christianity or then to Catholicism and change their names. But in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, the African names were stripped from enslaved people. Then they were given other names. In many of the records, they have no names. They just sometimes can be a number or identified by a word that does not individualize them. And now there is a recognition that to bring this memory to life again, one of the ways of doing that is through these walls of names that you have been seeing the proliferation. And in many ways, they are inspired from what we see in Holocaust memorials like the Yad Vashem and many others that are emerging then either in Paris or even here in Amsterdam.
And that's an interesting question with the aesthetic form of using names, because they have such different meanings in the memorialization of the Holocaust and why they were deployed in the memorials of the Holocaust. Whereas in your work, you are Anna, you are complicating and objecting to the way the form is adapted or adopted to the memorialization of slavery. So can you say a little bit more about why, and Yechiel, you can chime in about what's the role of the names in the Holocaust memorials versus how more complicated use of names is in the way they've been deployed in the memorials to the enslaved people.
Okay, I don't know who goes first. I can go? Okay.
I think you can go, yes.
Okay. It's an interesting point. Then in terms of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, then in the difference, I would say, is really that apparently that there is a demand that comes from the descendants that when we give names, you are individualizing then those who are no longer there, even in cases when we don't have much information. This is one point. On the other hand, there is this issue of counting that appears when we are creating these memorials to formerly enslaved people. Then this, and the other problem that comes from there is that apparently then this discounting element and the issue of naming becomes then the best way considered by many of these social actors to reckon, and this would be the word with this past. Now, the problem that comes with that is that, of course, that the memorials, they are built to the descendants of the victims, but they are also created in many cases to engage those who are still living in these communities and to create a certain level of awareness about, for example, an university or another place where slavery existed, because we have now, for example, then this slave memorials with names, for example, William and Mary in Virginia. We have also one University of Virginia. Then universities are taking that as a model that could work. But apparently there is another, in some places, and we have some also that I discuss in the book, in the Whitney plantation in Louisiana. But the problem apparently is that for those who visit these places, there is an obstacle to engage names of people that those who are visiting are unrelated to, which is not the case in memorials very often to the Holocaust. Then it's very difficult to engage with spaces that have no sort of figurative element. Then representations of people, then through images, through visual images that sometimes come from, for example, then engravings and artworks. Then this is a difficult element. The fact that the names remain abstract for most people who visit these memorials, which is probably not the case when you are referring to the Holocaust. Then when we see these walls of names, as we see, for example, in other walls of names to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., where people, they leave flowers to specific individuals, that you have families going and visiting that place because this is the only marker of those people who were killed during the Holocaust. Then I don't know if it was too much handling, but let's see what Yechiel has to say.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think, yes, in commemorating the Holocaust initiative of Walls of Names, of Hall of Names, indeed they play a different role. It's an attempt to rehumanize the identity of the victim, to give them back their identity after, during the Holocaust, they were treated as numbers or they were dehumanized. So the act of naming, of giving name, which is also very central in Judaism, is an attempt to humanize and to in a way to deal with the experience of the Holocaust as an individual experience. And I think this is the leading commemorative tone both in Yad Vashem and in the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. But I think there is another issue which maybe also resembles what you mentioned, Anna. Well, as we know, most of the victims of the Holocaust, they don't have a grave. I mean, nothing remained, and usually in Judaism and in other cultures, obviously, names of the deceased are written, engraved on the matzevot, on the tombstone. And this issue of commemorating the Holocaust, especially I think in Israel, as an attempt not only to rehumanize the victims, but to rebury, to give the victims some sort of second burial, or basically to give them the burial that they never had, which is also a very central element in Judaism. And I think giving name, collecting names, it is perceived as really as a sacred duty in order to give both the victims some sort of everlasting memory, but also to, in a more general sense, to the families of victims and to Jewish societies around the world, some sort of sense of continuity that was usually maintained by cemeteries and burial and this kind of material remembrance. And by giving names, I think there is this sensibility of trying to reconnect to the victims of the Holocaust, to the very rooted Jewish traditions of naming the dead and remembering them as part of the community.
Actually, so this transition us very well so there was the localized aspect and the individual aspect that you just spoke about. And I'm thinking in relation to something that Professor Arroyo had in her book, where she noted, quote, incorporating the memory of slavery in the confined space of official museums remains a challenging task. And I think the same could be said about Poland. So with regards to the incorporation of the Holocaust, and the deeper question of the Jewish past into Poland's historical narrative about its own past. So for you, Professor Weizman, I was wondering if how could this be applied in the Polish case? And here I'm talking about how can we create a shared memory about the Holocaust that actually applies to how
or even Jewish past, right? It's more broadly, not just the Holocaust, but about the Jewish past.
Exactly. So what I mean, how can we more have a Polish memory that is more incorporating of the Jewish past in this case?
The national memory.
And you had somewhat talked about it in the context of Israel, but how does that figure it with, say, for instance, in Poland?
So this is an interesting question because Poland is really a country in which most of the memory work is being done by non-Jews. So there are hardly any Jews in Poland, and the commemoration of the Holocaust and of the Jewish past is in many ways a Polish endeavor, and in many ways remembering the question how non-Jewish Poles remember the Jews in Poland is many ways relates not necessarily to the Jewish past, but to the Polish present. Yes, so I would say that there are very different motives of remembering the Jews. Some activists are in a way trying to, I would say, use or instrumentalize in a positive way the Jewish memory in a way to really advance social and cultural changes within the society, to, in a way, using the Jewish story as a means to reimagine a more pluralistic and open-minded Polish society. But then again, you have the question that is very relevant in Poland, whose memory is it? And we had in recent years, while the right-wing nationalist government was in power, you can see a shift that in a way declared their commitment to remembering the Holocaust and commemorating the Jews, while they're trying to do is really to buttress the national Polish narrative by, for example, emphasizing the role of the Polish rescuers, the righteous among the nation, Poles who rescued Jews during the war. And you can see more and more initiatives that their way of dealing with the moment of the Holocaust was basically to tell the heroic stories of Poles who rescued Jews. And in a way, it resembled, I think, what Anna mentioned of how initiatives of commemorating slavery focuses or used to focus on the emancipators, for example, or for example, avoiding the question of local involvement in the slavery, which is also a tendency that we see in Poland, in a way to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust in a way that will clear local societies from any complicity. So yeah, so the fact that the commemoration of the Holocaust in Poland is done in a place where there are Jewish communities, yes, but they are not the ones who are basically the main stakeholders in dictating this memory, creates also all those kinds of tensions and disruptions and paradoxes. Yeah.
Actually, you actually just answered a question that I had that we wanted to close with, which is to whom does the past and the memory of the past belongs? And with the case of Poland, as I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think about not those who are gone, but the survivors who eventually left, and especially those who had made an attempt to return but then left. Sometimes I wonder, what is their stake in the memory that is made, not only about those who are gone, but also gone but are still here with us, but that might be of course, that might be for sort of like another book, but I really was thinking about the subject. But so you've kind of touched on that question. So I wanted to pass it to Professor Araujo, if you could also answer the question as to whom does the past and memory of the past belong?
Well, I would say that it belongs to all of us, to those who are descendants of those who are victimized, those who are descendants of perpetrators, those who are alleged bystanders, those who inherited the wealth and the legacies of these atrocities. Then I think that this is the challenge. Of course, that a level of, in terms of collective memory, this memory is passed down through generations and through the descendants. But as we move to a national memory or a memory that is official, such as the one that is crystallized in a museum, it belongs to everyone. Now, the problem that we have regarding the case of the slavery is that we have, as you know, very few with the museums, then in only one that is a public museum of International Museum of Slavery Museum that exists in Liverpool. The museums, the issue of Atlantic slavery is dealt in most museums. Then within, for example, in the case of the United States, we have the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and slavery is discussed in one exhibition in that museum. But African Americans made the decision to not have a slavery museum. Now, the problem is also that the history of African Americans, or the history of Afro-Brazilians, the history of Afro-Cubans cannot be then summarized or restricted to the history of the slavery. Then, on the other hand, we have museums such as the National Museum of American History, where now we don't need to talk much about the slavery there because we have slavery in the African American Museum, which means that if you want to learn about that, go to the Museum of Black People, because here is American history. And this, I think, that can be a problem, and probably a problem that we could have in museums dealing with the Holocaust and with Jewish history as well.
Yeah, I think so. If anybody wants to ask questions, please post them in the Q&A. And I think that is really nicely putting the challenges of incorporating the history, not just of slavery, but of African Americans' history into the national history, and in a very similar way that incorporating the Jewish past into Polish national history is presenting in Poland. That is, the two histories tend to be separated and not talked about as a shared history.
Or as you often noted, Magda, often European Jewry in their history is discussed apart from larger Europe, as if it's independent of it.
Yeah. In the same way that slavery is not discussed as part of European history, but of the colonies, and it's not European history is not able to really grapple with that. What I would argue is really a shared past. That is, the idea of a shared past is often seen as the sort of more in the coexistence, but a shared past also includes the shared experience of very dark aspects of history. One of our members of the audience noted that the last person who was born enslaved in the United States died in 1971. It seems.
So what I think I was referring to is the last child of an enslaved person who died a few years ago. Yes, that's correct for the audience.
So if there are no more questions, I mean, we have a lot, but I think we've been holding you for a long time. I am very grateful for the opportunity to put you two in conversation and to learn from your work. As I said, personally, it was wonderful to read your works together and in conversation. I've learned so much about each of your of your fields as someone who is not in Black studies, but who has really appreciated reading in Black studies to illuminate my own field in Jewish studies in ways that I would not have imagined before Wes and I began talking to each other and conversing about Black studies and Jewish studies. So I want to thank both of you for joining us in this very difficult time, which creates more dark history, dark past that will have to be dealt with in the next years and decades. And Wes, thank you for co-moderating and working on this series.
Yeah, and I think I would like to add, if anyone in the audience would like to sort of continue this conversation, you should go and look up their books and really check them out of the local library or go buy copies yourself, because they're very accessible, as accessible as the conversations that we just had now. So don't take this as just sort of a scholarly or academic forum. Magda and I very much enjoyed reading the books and believe they have the capacity to reach a broader public. So you have that option to continue the conversation with yourself through the books.
And we hope we'll continue to learn from you as well, and maybe hopefully in person at some point. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.